The last thing Ethan Parker remembered from his first life was the sound of his own name being erased. Immediately, Ethan Parker is no longer affiliated with Parker Industries. He remembered the boardroom's cold air conditioning, the way his grandmother Margaret Parker's mouth had thinned into a line while she read the statement her lawyers had prepared. He remembered Tyler Nash, his best friend since they were 9 years old building blanket forts in Ethan's backyard in Westchester. Standing just behind her chair, not quite meeting his eyes, wearing a suit that had been Ethan's idea for him to buy. He remembered the embezzlement charges that were never really about money. He remembered dying, 3 years later, broke and forgotten in a walk-up apartment in Newark, of a heart that had simply stopped trying. And then he remembered opening his eyes to sunlight, to the smell of his grandmother's rose garden drifting through an open window, to his own hands, 24 years old again. Unlined, uncalloused, and the date on his phone telling him it was exactly 1 week before the Founders' Gala. The night it had all started. He had 1 week of foreknowledge and no idea what to do with it until he did. The days blurred by like a fever. He walked past the Newark apartment building he remembered dying in, still under construction in this version of the timeline, a hole in the ground where his death would have eventually stood, and felt something in his chest crack open with a grief so specific it had no name in any language, mourning a version of yourself that technically hadn't died yet. He sat in Central Park at 6 in the morning, when the joggers were still sparse, and the light came slanted and gold through the plane trees, and made a list on the back of a dry cleaning receipt of everything that had led to his first, quiet, unremarked death. Every item on the list traced back to the same 3 words. The Parker name. He remembered, too, the small things that were somehow worse than the big ones. The way his grandmother's assistant had started calling him Mr. Parker instead of Ethan the week the scandal broke, as though formality could be a form of distance. The way old college friends had stopped returning calls, not because they believed the charges, but because believing them was so much less complicated than doubting the family that signed their favors. He remembered how, in the last months, the only voice on the phone that never once wavered had been Tyler's, apologizing, promising to fix it, promising things he never delivered, right up until the day Ethan died, still halfway believing him. I am not going to spend a second life dying slowly for people who never once checked if I was breathing, Ethan thought. And something in that decision, cold and clean as a diagnosis, settled the shaking in his hands for the first time in a week. Let him have it, Ethan thought, staring at his reflection in the mirror of his Fifth Avenue apartment on the 5th night of that strange borrowed week, already rehearsing the moment he'd have to say it out loud. Let Tyler have the name. Let him have the company, the gala, the grandmother, who loves the idea of an heir more than she has ever loved me. I don't want it. I want to live. It was, Ethan would later admit, a spectacularly bad plan, held together by nothing but stubbornness and the desperate hope that a man could disappear inside a city of 9 million people. He didn't tell anyone, not his lawyer, not his therapist, not the one cousin who might have actually cared. He simply began, quietly and methodically, taking his own name apart, the way you'd diffuse something built to hurt you, and told himself that whatever waited for him on the other side of anonymity, it couldn't possibly be worse than being loved conditionally by people who had never once asked what he wanted. He had not accounted for Julian Cole. A week passed in a blur of quiet, deliberate unmaking, and then, almost before Ethan felt ready for it, it was gala night again. The plaza's ballroom was already thick with orchestra music, and old money by the time Ethan arrived, the chandeliers throwing gold light across a sea of black tuxedos and diamond collars. He recognized every face he passed. That was the trouble with being raised in a fishbowl, and every recognition felt, this time, like a hook trying to catch under his skin and drag him back into a life it already watched destroy him once. Margaret Parker, 71, matriarch of Parker Industries, stood at the center of it all in emerald silk, the kind of woman who had never once in her life had to raise her voice to be obeyed. She caught Ethan's arm as he passed, nails sharp even through his sleeve. "You're late, and you look like you're about to be sick," she said, not unkindly, in the clipped way that was as close to affection as she came. "Smile. Tonight you're an heir, not a boy who skipped his own party." "Working on it," Ethan managed, and slipped away before she could inspect the lie any closer, guilt already gnawing at him. Whatever came after tonight, he knew, she would take it as a betrayal she never saw coming. And some small, stubborn part of him still wished there had been another way to be free of the name without also breaking the one relative who, however clumsily, had genuinely wanted him to shine tonight. Julian Cole, 32, was the kind of man photographers loved and profile writers feared, the reclusive owner of Cole Hospitality, a hotel and real estate empire that spanned 4 continents, known for buying failing properties and making them beautiful again. He rarely attended galas. He hated small talk the way other men hated heights. Tonight, he was only at the plaza because his mother had guilted him into it, and because Parker Industries owed his company a favor he intended to collect in person. Julian had learned, over a decade of galas exactly like this one, to hold his face in a particular polite neutrality, pleasant enough to photograph, distant enough to discourage conversation, and had spent the better part of an hour perfecting it while his mother introduced him to a rotating cast of eligible somebodies whose names he forgot before their handshakes ended. He was standing by the champagne fountain, doing expert-level math on how quickly he could leave without being rude, watching the orchestra's cellist saw through something mournful and Viennese when a waiter, no, not a waiter, a guest in a slightly too large borrowed jacket, holding a tray like he'd stolen it, moving with the barely contained momentum of a man being chased, collided with him at full speed. Champagne went everywhere, mostly on Julian's shirt. Oh no, I am so sorry. I didn't see you, I was running from. The stranger stopped talking abruptly, the way a man does when he realizes he's about to confess a crime to a witness. Julian looked down at the golden stain blooming across $400 of Egyptian cotton, then up at the man responsible for it. Messy dark hair, wide brown eyes gone round with panic, a crooked bow tie that looked like it had been tied by someone else and then aggressively loosened. Running from what? Julian said. Not really a question, more a request for entertainment. My grandmother, the stranger said, with the flat honesty of a man too far past caring to lie well, and also possibly hotel security, in about 90 seconds. Do you know if there's a coat closet on this floor? Julian blinked. In 32 years of galas, no one had ever asked him for directions to a hiding spot mid-apology. Second door past the ice sculpture, he heard himself say. You're a hero, the stranger said, already turning, and then paused, seeming to remember his manners were on fire along with everything else. Ethan, he added, holding out a hand that was, Julian noted, faintly trembling. Well, not tonight. Tonight I'm nobody. Sorry, that sounds unhinged. Long night, longer than you know. Ethan. Julian filed the name away the way he filed away useful things. Competitors' weaknesses, undervalued real estate, the precise smell of rain on hot pavement which he loved and would never admit to loving. He shook the offered hand. It was warm, and it held on a half-second longer than a handshake required. Julian, he said. Julian, Ethan repeated, testing it like a password. Somewhere behind him, a voice, a woman's, sharp with the particular anger of the very rich, called a name that was not Ethan's, and Ethan flinched like he'd been struck. I have to go. Thank you for the champagne bath. Sorry for, He fled toward the coat closet at a dead run, jacket flapping, and Julian Cole, who did not do impulsive things, who had built an empire on never doing impulsive things, found himself following. The closet was dark, cedar-smelling, crowded with fur coats that had probably cost more than Julian's first apartment. Ethan was crouched behind a rack of them when the door opened, and for one unbalanced second, in the sliver of ballroom light, their faces were very close together. You're not hotel security, Ethan whispered. No. You're also not leaving. No. Julian agreed, and felt something in his chest tilt sideways, the way a building does right before you realize it's actually you who has tilted. Ethan's breath had gone quick and shallow, close enough that Julian could feel the warmth of it against his jaw. Neither of them moved. Neither of them, for one long, suspended moment, wanted to. Then footsteps passed the door outside, unhurried, and the moment cracked open like an egg. I should go, Ethan breathed, not moving an inch. You should, Julian agreed, also not moving. The cedar and perfume dark of the closet pressed close around them, fur sleeves brushing Ethan's shoulders like something alive. He could hear his own pulse in his ears, could feel the warmth radiating off Julian's chest through 2 layers of ruined shirt, and some reckless, giddy part of him, the part that had already died once and apparently no longer feared consequences the way a sensible man should, wondered what would happen if he simply leaned the last 2 inches forward. He didn't, but he thought about it long enough that his ears went hot. It was Ethan who finally broke first, laughing, a startled, helpless sound, hand pressed over his mouth like he could stuff the laughter back in. This is the worst night of my life and somehow also possibly one of the best 5 minutes of it. What is wrong with me? Nothing, Julian said, with a certainty that surprised him. I'd like to know your name, your real one. Something shuddered behind Ethan's eyes, quick, practiced, sad. Trust me, he said softly. You really wouldn't. And then he was gone, out the door, down the service hallway, into whatever new life he was in the middle of stealing back for himself. And Julian Cole was left standing alone in a closet full of fur coats, holding a business card he didn't remember taking out of his own pocket and had apparently forgotten to give away. He looked down at it, then at the closed door. I'll find you, he thought, with the calm, immovable certainty of a man who had never once in his adult life failed to acquire something he wanted. He did not examine too closely why the thought felt less like ambition and more like relief. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent. Cabs idling on Fifth Avenue, the plaza's fountain lit gold against the dark, 100 small lives intersecting for a single unremarkable evening that neither man, standing on opposite sides of a closing door, yet understood would turn out to be the hinge on which both their futures quietly swung. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed, still in his gala clothes, bow tie long discarded, staring at the business card he'd found in his own pocket, embossed with nothing but a name and a phone number, no title, no company logo. As if Julian Cole, of all people, understood instinctively that some men needed to be approached without their net worth attached. He turned the card over in his fingers until the edges softened, and did not call the number, though his thumb hovered over it more than once before dawn. Not yet, he told himself. Not until I've actually built something worth introducing him to. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan, Ethan Parker no longer existed on paper. He'd spent his week of foreknowledge well. A shell company dissolved, a trust fund quietly signed over to Tyler Nash in recognition of his contributions to the family business. The family had always called him Cousin Tyler out of habit and affection rather than blood, a nickname from childhood that had stuck long after anyone remembered it wasn't literally true. A document his grandmother had been only too happy to have notarized. She hadn't wanted to disown him. Not really, not underneath the emerald silk and the sharp nails and the genuine hope that he'd shine that night. But she'd spent 71 years believing that love and legacy were the same transaction. And when Ethan came to her framing the transfer as his own ambition finally catching up to Tyler's loyalty, she signed it in under a minute, relieved to have the harder conversation handed to her instead of demanded of her. The Parker family lawyers, efficient as ever, had scrubbed his old accounts, his old apartment lease, his old life, and reissued a new set of documents under a name that had been sitting in a forgotten drawer since his mother's maiden days, Ethan Reyes. He took a duffel bag, $4,000 in cash, and a one-way bus ticket to nowhere in particular, and he told himself this was freedom. It felt, for the first week, exactly like drowning. He ended up in Chicago because the bus stopped there, and he was too tired to get back on. The city hit him first as sound. The elevated train screeching 2 blocks from the station, a language he didn't recognize spilling out of a taqueria's open door, the particular wind that came off Lake Michigan and seemed to know exactly which collar to slip under. He found a room above a laundromat in Pilsen, cheap and slanted and smelling permanently of fabric softener and fryer oil from the restaurant next door, with a radiator that clanked like it was trying to communicate in Morse code. He slept for 14 hours the first night and woke up not knowing, for one terrifying and then oddly peaceful second, who he was supposed to be. He got a job at a coffee shop 3 blocks away called The Daily Grind, a name so unimaginative that Ethan, despite everything, laughed out loud the first time he saw the sign, chalk-lettered and slightly crooked above a window fogged with steam. The owner, Sophia Reyes, no relation, a coincidence that made them both grin the day they discovered it, was 26, fierce, permanently ink-stained from the poetry she scribbled on order tickets, built like she could win a bar fight and quote Neruda in the same breath, and did not ask questions about why a man with a Parker Industries watch tan line on his wrist wanted a minimum wage job pulling espresso shots. You'll break at least 2 mugs your first week, she told him, sizing him up over the counter with the frank appraisal of a woman who'd hired plenty of runaways before. Everybody does. It's a rite of passage. And your hands are shaking, so coffee first, questions never, unless you want to offer them. I don't, Ethan admitted. Smart man, Sophia said, and handed him an apron, and just like that, for the first time since he'd woken up 24 again, somebody had looked at him and seen nothing but a man who needed a job, not a name that came preloaded with expectations. Everybody's running from something, she said, tying an apron around his waist on his first day. You'll fit right in. Just don't steal from the till, and don't fall in love with any of the regulars, they're all disasters. Ethan promised. He meant it, mostly. He did not, in that promise, account for a man in a charcoal overcoat who walked into the daily grind on a rainy Tuesday 6 weeks later, shook the water off his umbrella, looked directly at the barista behind the counter, and went very, very still. Ethan, Julian Cole said. The espresso portafilter slipped out of Ethan's hand and hit the floor with a clatter loud enough to make the whole shop turn. For one full second, Ethan simply stared, at the rain-dark shoulders of that same charcoal coat, at a face he'd apparently memorized far more thoroughly than he'd let himself admit over 6 weeks of steaming milk and pretending not to think about a stranger from a closet. His heart did something complicated and traitorous, somewhere between panic and an emotion far too close to joy for comfort. Oh my God, Ethan managed, crouching to retrieve the portafilter with hands that were no longer entirely steady. Oh my God, you can't just, how did you? I look like I've seen a ghost, don't I? I feel like I've seen a ghost. You're supposed to be in New York, Ethan hissed 20 minutes later, once he'd dragged Julian to the back alley behind the shop on his break, heart still going like a rabbit's. Cole Hospitality doesn't even have a Chicago property. It has one now, Julian said, entirely too pleased with himself. I bought the Wheeler building on Tuesday morning. You bought a building to find me? I bought a building because it was a good investment, Julian said, with the particular smugness of a man who was lying and knew he wasn't fooling anyone. The fact that it happens to be 4 blocks from where you appear to have relocated is a happy coincidence. Ethan stared at him. Rain was coming down soft and gray behind Julian's shoulders, beating in his dark hair, and against every instinct screaming at Ethan to be furious. Something warm and unwilling was unfurling instead, somewhere under his sternum. You had 1 business card and half a first name, Ethan said. How did you even? I have resources, Julian said, and a memory for faces. And, he added, softer, some of the polish falling away, I didn't stop thinking about a man who apologized to me for ruining my shirt like it was the worst thing he'd ever done, on a night I later learned he'd just walked away from an entire fortune. I wanted to know why. Ethan's throat went tight. Nobody, not once in either of his lives, had chased him for a reason that had nothing to do with the Parker name. It's a long story, he said. I'm told I'm an excellent listener, Julian said. Also, your coworker with the eyeliner just texted me. I got your number off your work schedule taped to the window. I'm aware that's slightly deranged. To say your shift ends at 4, and that if I hurt you, she will, quote, end my entire business empire with a rolling pin. A laugh burst out of Ethan before he could stop it, bright and disbelieving. That sounds like Sophia. She also called me rich boy 4 times in the span of 90 seconds and confiscated my umbrella as, and I quote, collateral for your good behavior. I believe I am currently being held hostage by your employer. She does that, Ethan said, wiping steamed milk off the counter, mostly to give his hands something to do, that wasn't reaching for Julian's ridiculous rain damp, entirely too handsome face. It's how she says hello to people she's decided she likes. I'm flattered. And slightly concerned about my umbrella's chances of survival. You should be. She once turned an umbrella into a plant steak. Didn't even blink. I'd like to take you to dinner, Julian said. Not the version of you performing for a gala, whoever you actually are. Ethan Reyes, or whatever your name turns out to be by the time we're done ordering appetizers. Ethan looked at him, at the absurd sincerity of a billionaire standing in a coffee shop alley in the rain, having bought a building on a hunch, and felt the careful walls of his second chance at life crack, just slightly, right down the middle. He thought, briefly and absurdly, of the diner booth from his first life, of the cold vinyl seat and the pie he hadn't wanted, and wondered if this was what it felt like when the universe finally belatedly answered a wish you'd stopped believing anyone was listening to. Okay, he said. But I'm picking the restaurant. And it's going to be terrible and cheap and you're going to like it anyway. I'm counting on it, Julian said, and meant several things by that. Dinner was tacos from a truck on Halsted Street, eaten standing up because there was nowhere to sit, hot sauce dripping onto Julian's cufflinks while he pretended, with great dignity, not to notice. He told Ethan things he'd never said out loud to anyone in his social circle, that he'd built Cole Hospitality out of spite for a father who'd told him, at 19, that he'd never amount to more than a name attached to somebody else's money. That every failing hotel he bought and restored was, in some private and slightly embarrassing way, an act of proving that broken things could still be worth saving. That he ate takeout alone in hotel suites more nights than he'd ever admit to a journalist, surrounded by 4 continents worth of success, and no one, really, to share any of it with. That's the loneliest thing I've ever heard from a man holding a taco, Ethan said, not unkindly. I contain multitudes, Julian said dryly, and Ethan laughed so hard salsa nearly went up his nose, and something about the sound. Unguarded, real, entirely unlike the practiced warmth Julian usually got from people who wanted something from him, settled low and certain in Julian's chest, like a key finally finding the lock it was cut for. It was, against every prediction Julian could have made about himself 6 weeks earlier, one of the best nights of his life. Ethan told him everything, eventually, not that first night, but over the weeks that followed, in pieces, the way a man diffuses something dangerous, carefully, one wire at a time. He told Julian about a first life he shouldn't remember, about a best friend who became a thief, about a grandmother who loved a company more than a grandson. He told him, too, about smaller things, the exact shade of blue his mother's kitchen had been painted, a song she used to hum while cooking that he could no longer place the name of, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who all wanted a piece of a name instead of a conversation with the person wearing it. Julian listened without flinching, without once reaching for his phone to fact-check the impossible parts, and when Ethan finished, red-eyed and raw at 2 a.m. on Julian's borrowed hotel balcony, Julian said only, "So you gave away a fortune to buy yourself a life nobody could take from you again. When you say it like that, it sounds almost smart," Ethan said, wiping his face with his sleeve. "It's the smartest thing I've ever heard anyone do," Julian said, and meant it so plainly that Ethan had to look away, out at the lake, to keep himself from doing something reckless like crying, or kissing him. They set ground rules after that, the way 2 careful men do when something is clearly growing between them faster than either wants to admit. No public appearances. Ethan's face couldn't cross paths with Parker Industries press. No mention of Cole Hospitality's money in front of Sophia, who'd made it very clear she'd fight a Forbes list billionaire on principle. And no calling it dating, not yet, even though Julian started flying in for Tuesday night tacos on a regular basis, and even though Ethan started leaving the good oat milk out specifically for him, and even though neither of them acknowledged out loud that these were the exact behaviors of 2 men who were already, hopelessly, dating. "You're terrible at boundaries," Sophia informed Ethan one slow afternoon, watching him refold the same 3 napkins for the 5th time while he waited for a text back. "For the record, we're taking it slow," Ethan said. "He flew a private jet here on a Tuesday to watch you make lats for 6 hours. We're taking it slow for us," Ethan amended, and Sophia laughed so hard she had to sit down. It became a pattern neither of them named out loud. Julian learned the exact order of Ethan's closing routine: mop the floor, flip the chairs, count the till twice because the first count was never trusted, and started showing up early enough to help, badly, with the chairs, earning himself an official ban from touching the espresso machine after an incident involving foam and what Sophia still referred to, months later, as the milk volcano. Ethan learned that Julian took his coffee black except on the worst days, when he wanted it sweet enough to remind him of something, though he never said what. He learned the particular quiet that settled over Julian after difficult calls with his father, and how to fill it without asking questions, simply by sliding a day-old croissant across the counter and sitting close enough that their knees touched under the table. Neither of them called it dating. Both of them, without discussing it, started arranging their weeks around Tuesdays. It was Sophia, in the end, who first said the word out loud that neither of them would. She caught Ethan staring out the window one gray afternoon, mid-lat art, milk overflowing onto the counter while his brain was clearly somewhere over Lake Michigan waiting on a private jet, and set down her rag with the exhausted patience of a woman watching two idiots orbit each other in slow motion. "You know this is a relationship, right?" she said. "The flowers he sends when he can't make it. The way you've started saying, 'we' about restaurants you haven't actually eaten at together yet. This has a name, Ethan. It's called dating. You're doing it badly and loudly, and it's driving me up a wall. We're being careful," Ethan said, wiping up the spilled milk with more focus than the task required. "Careful is a word people use when they're scared," Sophia said, not unkindly. "You already survived the scary part. You died, remember? Everything after that is just bonus. Let it be good, Ethan. You're allowed." He didn't have an answer for that. He just stood there, cloth still in hand, and let the truth of it settle somewhere under his ribs, where it had clearly been waiting all along. It happened on the balcony, the same night Ethan told him everything, but there was a piece Ethan hadn't managed to get out until much later, after the tears, after Julian's silence had stretched into something Ethan mistook, briefly and painfully, for disbelief. "You don't believe me," Ethan said quietly, watching the lake glitter cold and black beyond the balcony rail. "That's fine. I wouldn't believe me either." "I believe you," Julian said, so immediately and so simply that Ethan turned to look at him, startled. "I'm not doubting you. I'm trying to imagine what it must have felt like, watching yourself do everything right and lose anyway, and then getting handed the exact same board and pieces and told to play again. I think if it happened to me, I'd have burned the whole city down out of spite before I ever found a coffee shop in Pilsen." Something in Ethan's chest, tight and defended since long before he'd ever met Julian Cole, loosened by a full degree. "There's a version of that first life," he admitted, "where I remember the exact moment I stopped fighting it. It was maybe 4 months before I died. I was in a diner at 2 in the morning, the kind with the sticky vinyl booths, and I ordered a slice of pie I didn't even want, just to have a reason to sit somewhere warm a little longer, and I remember thinking, very calmly, like it was a business decision, that nobody was coming. Not my grandmother, not Tyler, nobody. And instead of being devastated by that, I just felt tired. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that finally putting it down almost felt like relief, even though what I was putting down was hope." Julian reached over and laced their fingers together without a word, thumb tracing slow circles over Ethan's knuckles, the kind of touch that asked for nothing and gave everything. "When I got the chance to do it again," Ethan continued, voice steadier now, "I didn't wish for the fortune back. I didn't wish to fix the friendship with Tyler, or win my grandmother's approval, or clear my name in some big, dramatic courtroom scene. I just wished, quietly, selfishly, for a diner booth that didn't feel so cold, for somebody, anybody, to walk in before 2 a.m. and ask if the seat across from me was taken." "It's taken," Julian said immediately, throat tight. "It's been taken since the moment you apologized to me about it like it was a moral failing. I just didn't know I was applying for the position until right now." Ethan laughed, wet, surprised, entirely undone, and pressed his forehead to Julian's shoulder, and for a long time neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed saying. The lake wind moved past them, indifferent and constant, and somewhere below, the ordinary city carried on, not knowing that 2 lives had just quietly, irreversibly rearranged themselves around each other. It was Julian who finally broke the not dating fiction, 3 months in the middle of an argument about pasta. By then, the rhythm of their almost relationship had become so familiar it was almost embarrassing to still call it undefined. Julian had a key. Ethan had never asked how that happened exactly. It had simply appeared on his ring one Tuesday, wordless, the way Julian did most things that mattered too much to say out loud. Sophia had started keeping a spare Cole hospitality mug behind the counter, for His Highness, and pretended not to notice how Ethan's whole face changed the second. The bell above the door announced Julian's arrival, 3 minutes early, every single week, like he couldn't stand to be even a second late. They were in Julian's Chicago apartment, sparse, gray, expensive, and increasingly cluttered with things that were unmistakably Ethan's: a chipped daily grind mug, a stack of second-hand paperbacks, one ridiculous cat-shaped oven mitt that had appeared from nowhere and refused to leave. Ethan was standing at the stove, making his grandmother's marinara recipe from memory, the one good thing he'd kept from his first life, and Julian was leaning in the doorway watching him with an expression Ethan had learned, over 3 months, to recognize and studiously ignore. "You're doing the face," Ethan said, without turning around. "What face?" "The one where you look at me like I invented fire." "You make excellent marinara," Julian said, which was not a denial. Ethan turned around, wooden spoon still in hand, sauce splattered on his forearm, hair falling into his eyes, and something about the ordinary domesticity of the moment, the steam, the smell of garlic, the low golden lamplight, made Julian cross the kitchen in 4 steps and simply kiss him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a movie kiss, timed to swelling music. It was soft, and it tasted faintly of tomatoes and salt, and Ethan made a small, startled sound against his mouth before melting into it, spoon clattering into the pot, both hands coming up to fist in the front of Julian's shirt like he needed something to hold on to. When they broke apart, foreheads still touching, Julian said low, "I don't want to take it slow anymore. I want to date you. Loudly. Publicly, eventually when it's safe. I want to stop pretending the Tuesday flights are about your terrible coffee." "My coffee's not terrible," Ethan said, breathless laughing, eyes wet. It's the best in Pilsen. It's mediocre, and I've had it in 40 countries, Julian said. "I keep coming back for the barista. That's so cheesy," Ethan whispered, and kissed him again to prove he didn't mind. The sauce burned. Neither of them noticed for 20 minutes. Sophia, informed the next day, declared it disgustingly adorable, and made Ethan buy the whole shop pastries in celebration, on the grounds that watching 2 idiots fall in love in real time deserved some kind of dividend. There was a regular at the Daily Grind named Marcus Cole, no relation to Julian by blood, but his best friend and second-in-command at Cole Hospitality since business school. 33, sharp-tongued, allergic to sincerity, and delighted beyond measure to discover that his notoriously unattached boss had gone soft over a barista in Pilsen. "So this is him," Marcus said the first time he came in, sizing Ethan up over the rim of his sunglasses like he was appraising a hotel acquisition. "Smaller than I expected. Julian described you like you were carved out of a Renaissance painting." "He exaggerates," Ethan said, flushing to the roots of his hair. "He does not," Marcus said cheerfully. "It's actually a little disgusting. He hasn't shut up about you since Chicago. I had to sit through 45 minutes of a board meeting where he used the phrase compelling value proposition to describe your laugh. Compelling value proposition, Ethan. He's a menace." "I'm going to kill him," Ethan said, delighted despite himself, already composing the teasing text he'd send the second Marcus left. Julian, informed of the betrayal that evening over video call, did not even attempt to deny it. "It was a compelling value proposition," he said, entirely unbothered, propped against the headboard of a hotel bed in Singapore, tie loosened, looking tired in the particular way that made Ethan want to fly across the world just to put a hand on his jaw. "I stand by the phrasing. You're insufferable. You're smiling. I can hear it. I am not. Ethan Reyes, I have memorized the sound of your smile the way other men memorize stock prices. Don't lie to a man who imports charcoal-grade obsession as a personality trait. That's the most unhinged thing you've ever said to me, and somehow also the most romantic," Ethan said, laughing helplessly into his pillow. 3,000 miles between them, and none of it mattering at all. It went both ways. When a hotel gossip site ran a blurry photo of Julian at a charity auction, laughing at something a striking, expensively dressed art dealer had said, Ethan spent one entire evening pretending he hadn't seen it, right up until Julian called, and Ethan answered with a flat, "So, the art dealer?" "Jealous?" Julian asked, sounding delighted. "Observant," Ethan said, with as much dignity as a man could muster while absolutely, catastrophically jealous. "She was trying to get me to fund a gallery opening. I told her I was seeing someone who ran a much better establishment, a coffee shop in Pilsen with, and I quote myself directly, the best oat milk latte in the Midwest, and an owner who threatens me with kitchen equipment on a semi-regular basis." "You did not say that. I absolutely did." She looked deeply confused and slightly afraid. "It was one of my proudest moments this quarter." Ethan laughed until his ribs ached, and when he finally caught his breath, he said, quieter, "I like this, whatever this is. The teasing, the Tuesdays, all of it." "Good," Julian said, just as quiet, "because I have absolutely no intention of stopping." There was, admittedly, an adjustment period. Ethan had spent a first life learning to read a room full of people who wanted something from him. He had never, not once, learned how to simply be teased by someone who wanted nothing but his laugh in return. The first few times Julian ribbed him about his questionable taste in second-hand paperbacks, about the truly heroic number of sugar packets he stole from the shop's condiment station, about his stubborn insistence on biking to work in weather no sane Chicagoan would attempt. Ethan had gone quiet and careful, waiting for the joke to turn into a test he might fail. It took Julian weeks to understand why, and longer still to unlearn the reflex of apologizing for teasing at all, until one evening Ethan finally laughed instead of flinching, bright and unguarded, and something in Julian's chest settled like a held breath finally released. "There he is," Julian murmured, more to himself than to Ethan, and never mentioned it again. But he noticed, after that the teasing came easier for both of them, lighter, less like testing ground, and more like the ordinary foolish shorthand of two people who trusted each other enough to be silly. The trouble arrived, as trouble does, exactly when things were softest. Tyler Nash, 25, newly minted heir of Parker Industries, had grown up 2 houses down from the Parker estate in Westchester, the son of Margaret's longtime accountant, close enough to the family to be folded into every holiday photo, but never close enough to be named in the will. He and Ethan had built blanket forts together at 9, snuck out to see fireworks at 14, cried together, badly loudly, on the Parkers' back porch the week Ethan's mother died. Somewhere in the 20 years since, watching a best friend inherit a world he could only ever visit, something small and bitter had taken root in Tyler that even he hadn't fully recognized as envy until it was already too late to pull out cleanly. He hadn't set out to destroy Ethan. He'd set out, in his own convoluted logic, to finally have something of his own, and discovered, 6 months into wearing another man's name, that a stolen crown sits far heavier than an earned one. The board didn't trust him. Margaret, who had never formally adopted him into anything but a title, watched him with the flat calculation of a woman waiting for him to fail so she could replace him with someone better. He had the name, the title, the office, and none of the instincts, none of the goodwill Ethan had built over years, none of the ease. Worse, whispers had started. A journalist digging into the cousin who'd so conveniently signed away a fortune days before a scandal. Tyler, cornered and desperate, did what desperate men do. He hired a private investigator to find Ethan, not out of guilt, but to ensure the loose thread stayed buried, or, failing that, to have leverage ready in case Ethan ever tried to come back and expose him. The investigator found Ethan in 11 days. Cole Hospitality's very public purchase of the Wheeler building had left a trail even an amateur could follow. Tyler sat on that knowledge for months, telling himself there was no reason to act as long as Ethan stayed quiet and out of the papers, until a journalist's early questions about the transfer made quiet start to feel like a countdown instead of a comfort. Tyler showed up at the daily grind on a Thursday morning in a coat that cost more than the shop's monthly rent, and the bell above the door had never sounded so much like an alarm. Rain streaked the front windows. The shop was half full, the espresso machine hissing its low, familiar heartbeat, and for one disorienting second Ethan's brain simply refused to process the shape standing in the doorway. A ghost pulled directly out of a life he'd worked 6 months to bury. "Ethan," Tyler said, and for a moment the old easy warmth of childhood friendship flickered across his face before something colder replaced it. "We need to talk." Ethan's hands went still on the espresso machine. 6 months of hard-won peace crystallized into something sharp and watchful behind his eyes. "There's nothing to talk about, Tyler. There's a journalist," Tyler said, voice dropping, glancing at the handful of customers pretending not to eavesdrop, "asking questions about the transfer, about you. If this blows up, it blows up on both of us. That sounds like a you problem," Ethan said, and was surprised by how steady his own voice came out. "I need you to sign an NDA, a clean one. Say the transfer was your choice, no coercion, no scandal, and Tyler hesitated, something almost like shame crossing his features. "I'll make sure none of it touches your new life. I know you have one now. The billionaire boyfriend and everything. It's all over the society pages this week, by the way, in case you hadn't seen." "You've been keeping tabs on me," Ethan said flatly. "For 6 months, while I was building a life out of nothing, you were paying someone to watch me do it." "I told myself it wasn't like that," Tyler said, and had the decency, at least, to look uncomfortable saying it. "I told myself it was due diligence, protecting the company. But you're right. It was never really about the company, was it? It was about making sure you stayed gone, because some part of me knew that if you ever wanted the name back, the board would hand it to you in a heartbeat, and I'd be the guy who borrowed a life for a year and gave it back the second the real owner knocked. Ethan's stomach dropped. He hadn't seen. Julian had promised discretion, had promised Ethan control over when and how his face reappeared in the world. Julian moved in, and some photographer at a charity dinner Julian had attended alone last week had apparently caught him distracted, checking his phone, smiling at a text, and speculation columns did the rest. "Get out of my shop," Ethan said quietly. "Ethan. I gave you everything, Tyler. The name, the company, the family that never really wanted me anyway. I didn't do it because I forgave you. I did it because I wanted to be free of all of it, including you. Sign your own NDA. Leave me out of your mess." For a moment, something raw and young passed over Tyler's face. The ghost of the boy who'd built blanket forts, who'd cried at Ethan's mother's funeral harder than Ethan had, who had somewhere between there and here made a choice he couldn't take back. "For what it's worth," Tyler said, quiet now, "I hate every day of it. The name doesn't fit. It never did. I think some part of me always knew it was yours to wear, not mine." Then he left, bell jangling, out into the gray Chicago rain, and Ethan stood shaking behind the counter, staring at nothing, hands braced flat against the register, like it was the only solid thing left in the room. Sophia came around the counter without a word, didn't ask what had happened, just wrapped an arm firmly around him and held on, the way you hold a mast during a storm, until the shaking finally slowed. The rest of the shift passed in a fog. Customers came and went, oblivious, ordering their oat milk lads and their drip coffees, while Ethan moved through the motions on muscle memory alone, his mind still snagged on Tyler's face in the doorway. The guilt in it, the exhaustion, the strange grief of watching someone finally admit, out loud, that the thing he'd stolen had never once fit him right. Ethan didn't know yet whether he felt vindicated or simply tired. Possibly both. Possibly that was allowed. "Call him," she said eventually, meaning Julian, meaning it the way a friend means an order dressed as a suggestion. The rich one. "Whatever this is, you don't carry it alone anymore." That's kind of the whole point of him, isn't it? Ethan pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, and for the first time since he'd woken up 24 again, in a life he was rebuilding from nothing, let himself believe that might actually be true. Julian arrived that night, off a flight he'd cut short by 2 meetings, still in the suit he'd worn to a boardroom 800 miles away, tie shoved carelessly into his coat pocket, hair windswept from running the last 3 blocks when the cab got stuck behind a stalled bus. He found Ethan sitting on the fire escape outside his own apartment, knees pulled to his chest, the cold metal grating biting through his jeans, staring out at the orange smear of streetlight on wet asphalt like it might have answers he didn't. "You didn't have to fly back," Ethan said, not turning around, though his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Yes, I did," Julian said, and climbed out through the window, settling onto the cold metal grating beside him, without a hint of concern for the $800 suit meeting rusted iron. "I saw the society page," Ethan said, before Julian could speak, and then Tyler showed up at the shop. "It's happening, isn't it? The thing I ran to Chicago to avoid. It's finding me, anyway." Their shoulders pressed together, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Just let the city hum beneath them, sirens somewhere blocks away, a train rattling on the elevated tracks. "I should have been more careful," Julian said finally. "I got comfortable. I forgot the world was still watching me, even when I thought I was just a man having dinner. I'm sorry. That's on me." "It's not your fault Tyler's a coward," Ethan said. "No. But it's my fault you're sitting on a fire escape at midnight instead of asleep in a bed that has you in every part of it that matters to me." Julian turned, took Ethan's cold hands in his own warmer ones, and waited until Ethan finally looked at him. "I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just brace for it." Ethan's breath caught. "Okay. I don't care about the name on your birth certificate," Julian said. "I didn't fall for Ethan Parker, heir to a fortune I could buy twice over if I wanted to. I fell for a man who spilled champagne on me and apologized like it was a war crime, who makes mediocre coffee with his whole heart, who gave away everything rather than live a life that wasn't his. I am not scared of Tyler Nash, or a journalist, or a society page, or your grandmother, or anyone else who thinks they get a vote in this. You are not going back into hiding. You are not signing anything that makes you smaller to keep someone else comfortable. Whatever happens next, we face it standing up, in daylight, together. You belong to me, and before you make that face, I don't mean it like property. I mean it the way a harbor belongs to a ship that's been looking for one its whole life. You have a place to come back to now. It's me. It's always going to be me. Ethan sat with that for a long moment, letting the city noise fill the silence around it. A siren fading somewhere south, the elevated train's distant rattle, the ordinary hum of a world that had no idea it was witnessing something that felt, to Ethan, like the entire shape of his second life quietly clicking into place. He thought of the boardroom where his first life had ended, the cold applause of people erasing his name. He thought of Tyler's face in the coffee shop doorway, the guilt he hadn't expected to see there. He thought, finally, of a closet full of fur coats and a stranger's hand not quite letting go of his, of every small, unremarkable decision that had somehow, against every statistical likelihood, led him here, to this fire escape, to this man, to a version of safety he hadn't known how to imagine until it was already holding his hands. I ran because I thought the only way to be safe was to be nobody, Ethan said quietly. I didn't think there was a version where I got to be somebody, the real one, and still be safe. You're the first person who's ever made those two things feel like they could exist in the same sentence. Ethan made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pressed his face into Julian's shoulder, breathing him in. Cedar and rain and something that had, somewhere in 6 impossible months, started to mean home. That was the least billionaire thing you've ever said. Ethan mumbled into his coat. I've been practicing it for weeks, Julian admitted. In the mirror. Don't tell Sophia. Too late, said Sophia's voice from the fire escape ladder below, where she had absolutely been listening the entire time, phone very obviously recording. This is going in your wedding speech, Cole. I'm framing it. They faced it together, exactly as Julian promised. Ethan called the journalist himself, a woman named Priya Anand, sharp and fair, 31, who'd covered corporate scandal for a decade and had grown tired of stories that punished the wrong people, and told her the truth, all of it on the record, sitting across from her at a diner 2 blocks from the daily grind, with Julian's hand resting, steady and silent, on his knee under the table the entire time. Not the truth Tyler had feared, but the real one. That Ethan Parker had walked away from a fortune, by choice, that Tyler Nash carried a guilt he'd never fully earned forgiveness for, and that none of it, in the end, was really anyone's business except the family it belonged to. Priya listened, took careful notes, and when the piece ran a week later, its headline was nothing like the scandal Tyler had feared. It was, instead, a quiet, almost tender profile titled, "The Heir Who Chose Freedom Over a Fortune," and what he found instead. Margaret Parker read it in her Fifth Avenue study, with her reading glasses perched low on her nose, and, watching her family's carefully managed reputation take an entirely different, unexpectedly sympathetic shape than she'd ever have engineered herself, did something Ethan hadn't predicted. She invited him to dinner, not to reclaim him. To apologize, in the clipped, awkward way of a woman who had never learned softness and was trying to learn it now, too late for it to fix everything, but perhaps not too late to fix something. The dinner was stiff at first, all the wrong silences, Margaret's fork clicking too precisely against porcelain while she asked careful, distant questions about Chicago, as though it were a foreign country she was considering visiting. But halfway through the second course, she set her fork down, folded her hands, and said, without preamble, "I loved your mother very much, and I have never known what to do with the parts of you that reminded me of her instead of this family. That is my failure, not yours. I am sorry it took a stranger's newspaper article to make me say it." Ethan didn't forgive her fully. Some walls take longer than a dinner. But he let the door stay open a crack, because Julian, sitting quietly beside him through the whole meal, had taught him gently that freedom didn't have to mean burning every bridge to the ground. When Margaret reached across the table at the end of the night and pressed his hand briefly, awkwardly, the way someone touches something they're afraid might break, Ethan let her. Tyler kept his place in the family, but 3 weeks later, stepped down as CEO in favor of a board-appointed president, choosing instead a much smaller role in the philanthropic arm, the part of Parker Industries that had, ironically, always suited him better than boardrooms ever had. The first time Ethan saw him afterward, at a low-key foundation dinner he hadn't planned on attending. Tyler looked lighter than he had in years, like a man who'd finally set down a bag he'd been carrying since he was 9 years old. "I heard you're good at the grant work," Ethan said, testing the waters, not quite friendship yet, but no longer quite a wound either. "Turns out I like giving things to people more than taking them," Tyler said, with the ghost of the old easy grin. Who knew? He and Ethan did not become best friends again, but they stopped being enemies. Sometimes that has to be enough. And Ethan Parker, Ethan Reyes, whoever he was choosing to be that particular Tuesday, stood on a rooftop in Chicago 6 months later, in front of exactly 19 people. Sophia had made him promise, all people who'd have shown up even if he were still broke and unknown, and married Julian Cole under a string of cheap paper lanterns Sophia had insisted on over Julian's very expensive florist's objections. The morning of, Ethan had woken before dawn in the loft above the Wheeler building, unable to sleep, and found Julian already awake beside him, watching him with the quiet, unguarded softness he only ever wore when he thought no one could see it. "Nervous?" Julian had asked, tracing slow circles against the back of Ethan's hand. "Not about you," Ethan had said. "Never about you. About all of it being real. About getting to keep it." Julian had kissed his knuckles, one by one, and said nothing because some reassurances didn't need words. They just needed showing up, every single day, until the fear finally wore itself out. The lake wind carried the smell of rain that never quite arrived, mixing with candle wax and the too-sweet drugstore cologne of Marcus, who'd cried before the ceremony even started and blamed it loudly on allergies. Fairy lights wound through the fire escape railing where, months earlier, Julian had first said the words that changed everything. Ethan had insisted on that detail, over every objection about symbolism being a little on the nose. Some things, he'd said, deserved to be witnessed twice. Julian wore navy instead of black, at Ethan's request, because he said Julian's eyes did something unfair to him in navy, and Ethan wore a pair of cufflinks that hadn't existed a week earlier, engraved, quietly commissioned, pressed into his palm by Margaret herself, at the rehearsal dinner with nothing more than a whispered, "Your mother would have adored him. Consider this the wedding gift she never got the chance to give you." For the record, the officiant, Sophia, ordained online for the occasion, sobbing through her own vows reading, announced, "The groom on the left once threw a rolling pin threat at the groom on the right's entire company. I stand by it. It worked out." Julian laughed so hard he had to be handed a tissue mid-ceremony. When it came time for vows, Julian went first, and for a man who negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking, his hands shook badly enough that he had to set down the small card Marcus had made him write backup notes on, and simply speak instead. "I've spent my whole life acquiring things," he said, eyes never leaving Ethan's. "Buildings, companies, things I could point to and say, I made that better than I found it. I never once thought a person could do on my shirt and apologized like it was the end of the world. And I spent the next 6 months slowly discovering I'd rather be undone by you than be untouched by anyone else. You didn't need saving, Ethan. You'd already saved yourself. I just got lucky enough to be standing there when you decided you were allowed to be happy, too." Ethan, when it was his turn, laughed wetly and wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist before he could even start. "I died once," he said, and heard the 19 guests go very still, not knowing quite what to do with that, before he pressed on, voice steadying. "Not metaphorically. I actually did, and I came back with exactly one plan, which was to disappear so thoroughly that nothing could ever hurt me again. It was a terrible plan. It would have worked, probably, if you hadn't followed me into a coat closet and then, several weeks later, bought an entire building because you couldn't stop thinking about my face. I used to think being safe meant being invisible. You taught me it actually means being known, completely, name and all, by someone who isn't going anywhere. I choose you. I would choose you in every life I get, whether I remember the others or not." There was not a dry eye on the rooftop by the time they kissed, not even Marcus's, who blamed the allergies again to increasingly diminishing returns. Ethan, watching Julian's face crumple with pure, unguarded joy above the collar of a borrowed navy suit, thought, "This is the moment. This is the one I was reborn for." Not the fortune, not the name, this. They kissed as husbands under lanterns swaying gently in the lake wind, and somewhere in the crowd, Tyler Nash, invited, at Ethan's insistence, because some doors deserve to stay open even when they're hard to look at. Clapped the loudest of anyone, tears on his face he didn't bother hiding. It was, everyone agreed, a spectacularly happy ending for a story that had started with a spilled glass of champagne and a man running from his own name. 18 months into marriage, Julian Cole had learned exactly 3 things his husband could not be trusted with before 9 in the morning: sharp objects, important business decisions, and pancake batter. He had also learned that their apartment, a converted loft 2 floors above the Wheeler Building's lobby, the very building Julian had bought on a hunch the week he tracked Ethan to Chicago, smelled permanently of a strange, comforting mixture of cedar cologne, old paperbacks, and whatever culinary disaster was currently unfolding in the kitchen. He wouldn't have traded the smell for all the 5-star suites on 4 continents combined. "I followed the recipe," Ethan announced, standing in the kitchen of their now shared apartment, half Chicago loft, half ridiculous, because Ethan had insisted on keeping the daily grind mug collection despite owning actual money now, surveying a pan that appeared to be actively smoking. "You followed a recipe the way a tornado follows a flight path," Julian said, not looking up from the contract he was reading at the counter, though the corner of his mouth was fighting a losing battle against a smile. "Rude, also correct. Also, I need you to taste this before I decide if it's edible or a fire hazard. Those aren't mutually exclusive categories in this kitchen. I will divorce you," Ethan said with great dignity, flipping a pancake that landed half on the pan and half on the stovetop. "You absolutely will not," Julian said, finally setting down the contract, crossing the kitchen, and stealing a bite directly off the spatula before Ethan could stop him. He chewed. His eyebrows did something complicated. "This is actually not terrible." High praise from a man who's eaten at every 3-star restaurant on 4 continents. "I've also eaten your first attempt at marinara, 3 months into dating, which you swore was a bold reinterpretation, and was in fact just burned garlic and regret. This is an improvement. You married me after that marinara," Ethan pointed out, delighted. "That's on you." "Worst business decision of my career," Julian said solemnly, sliding an arm around his waist, resting his chin on Ethan's shoulder to watch the pancake situation deteriorate further. "Devastating losses. Would do it again immediately." Sophia, who had, against all odds and several loud objections from Julian's board, been hired as head of hospitality-side cafe operations for Cole Hospitality's boutique hotel line, a job she'd taken specifically so she could keep threatening Julian with kitchen equipment on a professional basis, arrived unannounced through the door they'd stopped locking for her months ago, took one look at the smoke alarm's warning blink, and sighed with the weariness of a woman who had seen this exact scene 40 times. "I brought real pancakes," she said, holding up a takeout bag, "because I love you both and I refuse to attend another emergency room visit over a Bisquick incident." "That was 1 time," Ethan said. "It was 2 times, and the second time you tried to blame the smoke detector. The smoke detector was being dramatic." Julian, laughing quietly into the crook of Ethan's neck, thought, not for the first time, but with the same warm, grounded certainty every single time, that this was the strangest, most unglamorous, most perfect life a man who owned 4 hotel chains across 4 continents could possibly have ended up with. A burnt kitchen, a best friend with a spare key, and 0 patience for either of them, a rescue pancake delivery, and a husband who had once given away a fortune, rather than live a life that wasn't truly his, and had chosen, out of everything the world could offer him instead, this. Mornings, smoke alarms, him, "Marry me again," Julian murmured against Ethan's ear, low enough that only he could hear it. "Just so I can say yes twice." "You're extremely sappy for a billionaire," Ethan said, turning in his arms, batter-stained and grinning, and entirely, finally, at home in his own name, whichever one he chose to wear on any given day. "Only for you," Julian said, and kissed him, while behind them, forgotten, the smoke alarm finally gave up its protest, and Sophia set the real pancakes down on the counter with the long-suffering affection of a woman who had, somehow, ended up with the best 2 idiots in Chicago as family. Later, once the burnt pan had been soaked, the real pancakes devoured, and Sophia had left with a threat to bill them for emotional labor, that everyone knew she'd never actually send. Ethan stood at the window with a mug of coffee, mediocre, exactly as promised, exactly the way he liked it, watching the lake catch the early light. Julian came up behind him, chin hooking over his shoulder, arms circling his waist, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "Any regrets?" Julian asked eventually, quiet, the question he still asked sometimes, even now, as though checking a door was still locked. "About any of it? The name, the company, all of it?" Ethan considered it honestly, the way he always did, because Julian deserved honesty and not just reassurance. "No," he said finally, leaning back into him. "I spent one whole life being Ethan Parker and dying quietly for it. I'd rather spend this one being nobody important at all, except to you." "You're plenty important to me," Julian murmured against his hair. "That," Ethan said, smiling into his coffee, "is the only title I ever actually wanted." Below them, Chicago went on waking up around its ordinary Tuesday. Buses sighing at their stops, the lake throwing back the first full light of morning, somewhere a delivery truck idling outside a bakery. Indifferent to the fact that two lives had rearranged themselves so completely around each other that neither man could quite remember, some mornings, which parts of this happiness had been chosen, and which had simply always, inevitably, been theirs. Julian pressed one more kiss to the crown of Ethan's head, and neither of them moved for a long, unhurried while, in no rush at all to let the morning start without them.